Let's talk about sex. What does it mean to have sex? What does that refer to? What counts as having sex? Or what counts as losing one's virginity? Now, our social world is just saturated with talk of having sex, right? Go to any Spotify playlist, and there are many, many, many songs about sex and sexual interactions. If you talk to folks, we all tend to assume that we know what it is to have sex. However, it's not clear that this category of what counts as sex is actually all that straightforward. It's also not clear that this category is doing the work that we want it to do. So, if we ask most people, most folks will say that someone has had sex. They experience penis and vagina sexual interactions. This is what we tend to define as having sex. It's an incredibly common view. This is what I'm going to call the standard view of what counts as having sex. However, this definition is making quite a lot of assumptions about the identities and the bodies of the people involved in this interaction. So, first of all, it's assuming that to any sexual interaction, in order for it to count as sex, there must be one person with a penis and one person with a vagina. But it's not always the case that folks who are hooking up have, respectively, a penis and a vagina. It's also not always the case that everyone has genitalia that's easily classified as being either a penis or a vagina. So, this standard definition of what counts as having sex is incredibly, both heteronormative and cisnormative. It's built up off of the assumption that everyone is not only straight, but has a sexed body that is easily classified and is going to be classified always and for all time within one sex and gender binary category. So there are some concerns about this definition of what it is to have sex, about whether or not it's actually inclusive of all the different possibilities for sexual interactions. Now, one possible response is to say, okay, well, maybe sex just means a certain kind of sexual interaction. Maybe we want to reserve this definition as a way of saying it just refers to penis and vagina sexual interactions, and there are other kinds of sexual interactions that we can name and identify. That's one possible response. However, in our current setup, we treat the specific category of having sex as inhabiting a particular kind of social status. We treat it as being the most significant or important kind of sexual interaction. And we can see this all over the place. We see this just even in the slang that we use. I think the slang is a little bit outdated at this point, but think about how people talk about getting to first base, second base, third base, home run, right? Right there, we literally see a hierarchy in which kinds of sexual interactions are considered significant or important, right? And it's holding penis and vagina sex as if that is the home run, as that is the most significant, that is the most important. It's not treating, certain kinds of oral sexual interactions, for example, as being that level of significant. If we were to say, maybe sex for folks when there is one person with a vagina, one person with a penis means penis and vagina sex. But if it's two people with vaginas, then maybe we mean something like oral vaginal stimulation or oral clitoral stimulation, right? Perhaps lots of people sort of hold up that as we just are going to have different definitions of sex, depending on what your identity is or depending on who is in this sexual interaction. But that response doesn't really work, specifically because we don't treat oral sexual interactions as being as significant or important as the kind of interactions that we traditionally label as having sex. If we were to go this route of saying, for straight people, this is sex, but for everyone else, this is sex, one of the things that that does is it implicitly devalues the sexual interactions that non straight people are having. It implicitly says that these are less real or less significant. To the degree that we might think that sexual interactions are an important component of a flourishing life, or more properly, that they can be an important component of a flourishing life. If we say that the most important sexual interactions are reserved for folks who are straight, once again, that's reinforcing this kind of social hierarchy in which straight folks are at the top and everyone else is viewed as being, they're also trying, as having less valuable or less flourishing lives. So there are good reasons why we might truly worry about this standard definition of what it is to have sex, and why we might think that merely opening up the definition or merely saying, okay, let's come up with several definitions, it's going to run into problems. The standard view of what counts as having sex also runs into problems with the way that it individuates individual instances of sex. So, for example, if you are hanging out with a friend and they say, I had this awesome night last night, I hooked up with this person, it was amazing. You respond with, that's so exciting, tell me all about it. How many times did you do it? Well, what are you really asking right there? On the standard view of sex, what that question is asking is how many times was there a penile ejaculation, right? We tend to count individual instances of sex based on male orgasms. We tend not to focus in on the sexual pleasure of other participants, right? So this, first of all, means that we don't really have a way to count how many times, say, two people who both have vaginas had sex in any individual encounter, right? We don't have a way for carving that up. So this definition, or this conception of counting individual instances of sex, really is centered on certain kinds of sexual encounters. More than that, it prioritizes men's sexual experiences and sexual pleasure. Now, flagging right here that I am using the term men specifically because it is built up off of cis conceptions of gender and sexuality. So this understanding of what counts as sex presumes that if somebody has a penis, that means that they are a man, and similarly, that all men have penises. This, once again, is pretty baked into this standard conception of what it means to have sex. So that standard conception, by focusing in on individual instances of penile ejaculation and saying that's what it means to have had sex, it prioritizes men's sexual pleasure. It reinforces this view of men as being sexually active, whereas women as being fairly asexual pretty often. It assumes that women don't have sexual desires of their own, and that women's main role within this model is to serve as gatekeepers who simply say yes or no to men who are then seeking sex. These ideas are even baked into our language in the ways in which we have all kinds of slang terms to describe certain kinds of penetration. We don't really have words to describe envelopment, right? The ways in which vaginas might instead be the active organ rather than prioritizing penises as the active organ in a sexual encounter, right? So we simply don't have language even to describe cis women's or people with vaginas as having this kind of sexual agency in the ways that we describe sexual interactions. All right, so we have some reasons to critically reflect on the standard view of what counts as having sex. This view defines sex as a penis penetrating a vagina. It holds that there's something distinctive or unique about a penis penetrating a vagina that separates that from other kinds of sexual interactions and justifies its place at the top of a hierarchy. So, what is special about a penis penetrating a vagina, right? So, what could it be that would justify its place at the top of this kind of hierarchy? Sometimes people will say that it's because penis and vagina sexual interactions are the sort of interactions that could result in pregnancy, that this makes it deserving of special kinds of consideration. And that's why we define having sex in these terms. But does that really hold up? So, first of all, only some penis and vagina sexual interactions actually have the potential to lead to pregnancy. And two, the possibility of pregnancy isn't the definition of what it is to have sex. So let's start with that first point. So, first of all, if somebody has completely gone through menopause, they're not in a position to be able to become pregnant. Regardless of what sexual interactions they have, pregnancy is not a possibility. But we wouldn't say that the very same sexual interaction of penis and vagina sex is sex before menopause, but no longer sex after menopause. That's not what we mean by that term. Similarly, if somebody is infertile or is using different kinds of contraceptives, for example, such that there is extremely limited possibility of causing or becoming pregnant, we still classify those interactions as having sex on the standard view. So, in fact, does not really seem to be the case that we are focusing in on penis and vagina sexual interactions because of pregnancy. Simply not how that concept works. That rationale doesn't really hold up. Moreover, we don't need to define sex in that narrow way in order to identify that certain kinds of sexual interactions can result in pregnancy. We can identify how pregnancy works, how it occurs, without defining all sex exclusively in those terms. And we can provide information about pregnancy and about reproduction so that people can make informed choices about their sexual interactions and what sorts of reproductive, decisions they might wish to make. Right? So we don't need to define sex purely in terms of penis and vagina sexual interactions in order to recognize that pregnancy is a significant kind of possible outcome. All right. Connected to the pregnancy point, sometimes people say that the reason we define sex in terms of penis and vagina sexual interactions is because these interactions could result in STIs. But other sexual interactions can result in STIs as well. And if the whole reason to define sex is is intended to mitigate concerns or risks of STIs, then only focusing in on penis and vagina sexual interactions actually increases the risk of STIs by providing limited and often misleading information. Okay, so it seems like it's not about actual physical safety or possible outcomes in terms of pregnancy or STIs. That doesn't justify putting penis and vagina sexual interactions at the top of that hierarchy. Sometimes people might say that there's something, particularly unique or important or distinctive about penetration. But why do we care so much about penises and vaginas then, right? If the penetration is the part that makes it significant. Well, there are many other body parts besides vaginas that can be penetrated, right? There can be oral penetration as well as anal penetration. And yet, notice the ways in which we describe those interactions. We describe them as oral sex and anal sex, which is distinct from the standard view of sex, right? Vaginal sex is still held up as the real or most important kind of sexual interaction right there. So we don't give that same recognition to other kinds of penetration. Similarly, by focusing in so much on penetration performed by penises, we don't give recognition to other kinds of penetration by, say, for example, tongues or fingers or strap-ons or dildos, right? So we don't give the same sort of recognition to these other sorts of interactions. But truly, what is the salient difference here between, say, vaginal penetration by a penis versus vaginal penetration by a strap-on? Like, what is it that makes one of these interactions count as sex on the standard view, but not the other? Connected to this, the standard view assumes that there must be at least two people involved for it to count as having sex. But if we think that what's important is something like penetration, then penetration doesn't necessarily involve two people, right? If we think that, maybe say penetration by a strap-on or a dildo should properly be counted as having sex, then why does it matter whose hand is at the end of the dildo, right? Why does it matter who is actually holding it if the exact same kinds of physical experiences and sensations are occurring regardless of if you yourself or somebody else is holding that dildo, right? Why does one of those count as a sexual interaction but not the other? More broadly, why are we so focused on penetration itself? Once again, that seems to be reinforcing this focus in on cisnormative men's sexual pleasure. Many cis women or folks who have vaginas don't experience orgasms from vaginal penetration, though some folks do, right? There's a whole variety of ways in which people experience important kinds of sexual pleasure, sensations, or kinds of sexually intimate connections or experiences. By reinforcing this kind of hierarchy in which vaginal penetration by a penis is prioritized, we really only focus in on certain kinds of experiences and certain kinds of interactions, often to the detriment of exploring and validating other kinds of experiences. So it's worth thinking critically, not just about how we've constructed this category of what counts as having sex, but whether this category is doing the work that we want it to do. If the goal is to use this to mark out particularly important or significant kinds of sexual interactions, it's leaving a lot out. If the goal is to give information about pregnancy or STIs, once again, it's simply misleading or providing inaccurate information. And it's doing all of this at the expense of recognizing the variety of different kinds of sexual interactions that could be taking place. So there's this important question we should be asking of, should we be talking about sex as this one distinctive interaction at all, or should we start broadening it out to be thinking about sexual interactions more broadly? And if we need to be specific, we can be specific. It's really important that we don't have murkiness in terms of what definitions of what counts as having sex. It's important that we don't have the variety of different definitions floating around. Because if somebody says, I'm really into hooking up, but I don't want to have sex tonight, it matters that everybody is on the same page about what that means. It matters that we are able to clearly communicate about these things. If a doctor asks, maybe a teenager, are you having sex? But the teenager defines sex in a very specific or narrow way, they might say no. And the doctor might not provide them with important information about their sexual health and ways to attend to their sexual well being. This is, in fact, why doctors do not ask that question. Instead, they ask, are you sexually active? Right? Which is a much broader category. So once again, it's important to be critically reflecting on how our category of what counts as sex works, as well as other ways that we could be engaging with this topic and whether some of those other ways might do the work more productively.